Today, we're going to talk about the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833. Now, on the surface, this sounds like a huge moral victory, right? A moment for the British Empire to pat itself on the back. But the real story, well, it's way more complicated and honestly pretty shocking. It's got this hidden cost that raises some really tough questions, even for us today.
So picture this. It's August 28, 1833. This act gets what's called royal assent, which basically means the king signs off and boom, it's law. For the abolitionists who'd been fighting for this for decades, this must have felt like the finish line, a promise to finally tear down the absolutely brutal system of slavery across most of the British Empire.
And this law did set almost 800,000 enslaved people on the path to freedom. But that freedom, it came with an absolutely staggering price tag. And the real kicker isn't just what that price was, but who got the money and who got the bill.
Okay, so to really get what this act was all about, we have to rewind a bit. This law didn't just pop into existence because everyone suddenly decided it was the right thing to do. Oh no, it was the result of a fierce, decades-long battle against some seriously powerful people with a lot of money at stake.
This was a slow, grinding fight. It really kicked off in the courts back in 1772, with the huge ruling that said slavery wasn't actually legal in England itself. Then you see abolitionist groups starting to form. And in 1807, a big step, Parliament outlawed the slave trade, the actual kidnapping and shipping of people across the Atlantic. But, and this is a huge but, actually owning people, that was still perfectly legal for another 26 years.
You had people like William Wilberforce, who basically dedicated their entire lives to this cause. For decades, he and his allies went head-to-head in Parliament with this incredibly powerful pro-slavery group called the West India Lobby. Think of them as the super PAC of their day, made up of super-rich plantation owners who were not about to give up their source of wealth.
So what was the tipping point? What finally broke this deadlock? Well, in the early 1830s, two seismic events, one happening thousands of miles away in the colonies and one right in London, completely changed the game and forced Parliament to finally do something.
And a huge part of this story is the resistance of enslaved people themselves. In 1831, a peaceful strike in Jamaica exploded into a massive rebellion known as the Baptist War. Now, it was brutally put down, but the sheer scale of it sent shockwaves through the British establishment. It was a terrifying wake-up call that the whole system was becoming dangerously unstable.
Right around the same time, a political earthquake was happening back in Britain. The Great Reform Act of 1832 got rid of what were called rotten boroughs. These were basically sham electoral districts, sometimes with just a few voters controlled by one rich guy. And guess who controlled a lot of them? Yep, the West India Lobby. Wiping out these boroughs stripped the pro-slavery guys of a ton of their political power. And suddenly, a path was cleared for an abolition bill to actually pass.
So, the path is clear, the votes are there, and the bill passes. Victory, right? Well, not so fast, because this wasn't some pure, simple declaration of freedom. It was a compromise, a really messy one, carefully designed to protect the bank accounts of the very people who'd gotten rich off of slavery for centuries.
And this is the core of it right here. Just look at the two sides of this deal. For the almost 800,000 enslaved people, freedom meant being forced into unpaid apprenticeships for their old masters for years. They got no money, no land, nothing to start their new lives. But for the slave owners, for losing their property, they got one of the biggest government bailouts in the history of Britain.
And that brings us to the most jaw-dropping part of this whole story. The debate in Parliament wasn't just about morality, it was about money. And the numbers we're talking about they're mind-boggling.
20 million pounds. That was the number. That was the amount the British government agreed to pay, not to the people who had endured generations of bondage, but to the slave owners as compensation for losing the people they claimed as property. Now, 20 million pounds might not sound like a crazy number today, but you have to understand the scale. That sum was 40% of the government's entire national income for the year. 40%. Can you imagine the government today setting aside nearly half of its entire budget for one single payout? It was absolutely colossal. So who cashed these checks? About half went to owners actually in the colonies, but the other half, it went to absentee owners living comfortably back in Britain. And we're talking about the absolute elite of society. Aristocrats, politicians, even church leaders. For example, the Bishop of Exeter was tied to a claim that paid out over £12,000. Another earl got over £26,000 for the 2,500 people he owned across 6 plantations.
Okay, so how does a government in the 1830s even come up with that kind of cash? Simple. It took out a loan, a massive loan. A loan so enormous that generations of British taxpayers were still paying it off until 2015. Yeah, you heard that right, 2015. Just let that sink in for a second. The debt for compensating slave owners stretched all the way into our lifetime. But here's the thing. Even this historic, incredibly expensive act wasn't the end of the story. Abolition was a long, messy process, and the 1833 law had some pretty big holes in it.
For starters, it didn't apply to huge territories controlled by the East India Company, so millions of people in places like India were left out. And that whole apprenticeship system, it was so abusive and basically just slavery by another name that they had to scrap it early. The fight was far from over, and activists had to form new groups to keep pushing for the end of slavery everywhere.
Which brings us to the big question at the end of all this. The Slavery Abolition Act was without a doubt a landmark moment, but its legacy is deeply, deeply complicated. It established this crucial idea that people cannot be property, but at the same time, it compensated the masters, not the enslaved. It really forces us to ask, how should we remember a history where the bill for freedom was paid by generations of taxpayers while the profits of oppression were cashed in by the oppressors themselves?